I'm wondering, as the Russians digest the response from NATO and from Europe more broadly and the United States, where you think this is going. Is there room for reconciliation here? Is there room for diplomacy to work?
Yeah, I mean, Johnson's talking to Putin later today, and he's going to Ukraine tomorrow. So certainly trying to show a very strong response there. I think the fact that we've continued to see diplomatic talks is obviously quite important. It shows that Russia's at least trying to stay at the table. But I think, what Russia ends up doing is entirely in the hands of Putin at this point, and no one really knows what he's going to do. And I think that the continued buildup that Russia has done on the Ukrainian borders and some of the other efforts that they've made, it shows that they're very serious about this, and they could just be posturing with the West. Russia has been really building up its strategic reserves, its currency reserves, its gold reserves, and it could potentially weather sanctions. And the question is just whether sanctions bite Russia more than the West at this point, and whether the West is willing to deal with the pain of those sanctions.
Well, Courtney, even if Vladimir Putin does not decide to make a move, does not decide to invade, we heard from Senator Bob Menendez over the weekend talking about a package of sanctions they're putting together up front, preemptively for action Russia has already taken. How much consensus is there between lawmakers on Capitol Hill and the Biden administration? How much cohesiveness on this issue?
Yeah, there's consensus on the idea that sanctions need to be done if there's an event. So if there's a cybersecurity attack or there's an invasion, there's consensus there. Republicans have been really pushing to do something prior to that event, which is part of the reason why you've been seeing negotiations between Menendez and Republican senators on how those sanctions would work. Potentially looking like a two-tier system where there are some sanctions that go into effect prior to an event and then other sanctions that would go into effect after an event. The Biden administration has been relatively quiet on how they feel about this. I think that the administration itself would prefer to have more leeway in how it goes about the sanctioning, and potentially sees sanctions as inhibiting diplomatic talks if they were to go into effect prior to Russia doing anything. That's a lot of the reason why we're seeing concern with Nord Stream 2, why Democrats kind of blocked Senator Cruz's Nord Stream 2 legislation earlier this month, because the administration has really been pushing for, at least on Nord Stream 2, to have that flexibility.
How much is this distracting from other things? We have the Fed picks to think about. We've got the Supreme Court to think about. We've got the CHIPS Act we need to be working our way through. We're still trying to figure out what Build Back Better is ultimately going to look like in its component parts. Courtney, how big a distraction is this? How much bandwidth is this taking up?
Yeah, so Congress came back today, and they came back to certainly a full slate. This is going to take a lot of bandwidth this week, but other events are still going to be happening. We're going to be watching the hearings for Sarah Bloom Raskin this week in the Senate Banking Committee, along with the other nominees. The House is going to try to get a vote on its version of USICA this week. And then potentially there's going to be some effort to conference the House's bill with the Senate's bill. And government funding has to be dealt with in the next 2 weeks. Timing might be an issue there, though. The fact that we're dealing with Russia and Ukraine might mean that we need to do another temporary spending increase on the budget. And that's something to keep in mind, particularly because the budget that's been proposed increases U.S. defense spending by $25 billion. So something to keep in mind in the background of Russia, Ukraine. But things are still getting done. Supreme Court pick, we still expect something from the administration by the end of February, and that's move in March and April. So we still anticipate things to get done, but certainly other issues like Build Back Better, that's very much on the back burner at this point.
You mentioned Sarah Bloom Raskin there. Where do you put the odds of her getting confirmed? How contentious could this be?
Yeah, I think that what we're going to hear this week in the hearing is a law on climate. We've seen oil and gas companies really lobbying aggressively against her nomination, trying to get Senators Manchin and Tester to flip on that. Saw the Chamber of Commerce come out kind of asking for a lot of scrutiny on her nomination as well. I think, of the potential picks for Vice Chair of Supervision, she might have been the easiest one to get through, but that does not mean that this is going to be an easy pick, particularly in the midst of financial regulators across the administration really showing more of an aggressive stance on climate. We're anticipating that the SEC is going to be releasing climate disclosure rules in the coming weeks to months. And so there's just an overall emphasis on climate and financial regulation. And I think given what's going on with the FOMC and inflation, the fact that there could be this climate mandate on top of inflation and employment is something that's going to get a lot of Republicans being very vocal this week.
Courtney, one final quick question from me. We spoke to the Commerce Secretary on the show last week. We spoke to the Intel CEO on the show last week. Both seem reasonably confident that the CHIPS Act is going to be expedited, that we could potentially see it this week, making some progress. What do you think the timeline looks like?
Yeah, so it could certainly get out of the House this week. The House's Competes Act could get out of the House this week. But what we have seen with the House's version is that they have added in some provisions that Republicans are against, particularly in regards to trade and on, again, climate. So what could end up happening is with the government funding bill, they could potentially just pull out the semiconductor funding, that $52 billion that's in USICA, and attach that to the government funding bill. That's one way that they could get this dealt with. But the overall idea of semiconductor funding, of critical technology funding, that's very bipartisan and very supportive. We're just seeing amendments and provisions being added onto this legislation that's making it more of a partisan issue.